Hello gamers, this is going to be a guide on how to occupy the top few spots on the arcDPS damage meter with Longbow Dragonhunter. Sometimes you can even beat the Weavers. Of all the pure DPS classes, Dragonhunter is usually the most wanted by all commanders. This guide will only cover Scepter Torch and Longbow, but if there is enough interest, I will also cover greatsword, which does significantly more damage but requires more finesse on positioning, especially if your commander never ever pushes deep. This guide will cover some basic rotation, some positioning tips, and when to situationally use certain skills. This guide assumes you are not playing against groups that die in one push, in which case a simple rotation guide will suffice. It also assumes that you have an experienced support firebrand in your party. Because you will realistically not have an experienced firebrand or even no organized commander on voice chat at all, I will also cover briefly clouding against a coordinated group at the end. If you are clouding alone against an organized group, I recommend clouding on a core guardian since it has 2 stun breaks. First of all, why play Longbow over staff? Longbow has lower average DPS over staff, especially if the enemy is running projectile reflex. But Longbow has greater burst damage. Longbow also has one of the strongest CC in the game in the form of Hunter's Ward, which I will refer to as cages. It is effectively an immobilize that cannot be cleansed unless you have stability. A simple stun break is not enough. Alternatively, certain leaps can escape the cage. The build is going to be a mix of Marauders, Dragon and Berserker with Runes of the Scholar. Sigils are Superior Sigil of Fire and Force on the Torch set, and Bloodlust and Fire on the Longbow. Flame Burst from the Sigil usually does more than 5% damage, so it is worth taking over Superior Sigil of Force when the DPS uptime is low, which is typical for ranged fights. Against one push groups, where the DPS uptime is very high, Superior Sigil of Fire is not going to out DPS Superior Sigil of Force. I will only briefly cover trait choices, as there are only 2 meaningful choices you can make on Power Dragonhunter. Take enough fire instead of right hand strength if you lack a fury source like a Herald in your party. On the Dragonhunter trait line, I recommend Soaring Devastation over Piercing Light when you are more comfortable with trap placement. Soaring Devastation comes with a 3-second immobilize, which is the strongest condition in the game because it prevents dodging. Otherwise, the cooldown reduction on your traps from Piercing Light is going to be more forgiving if you accidentally drop your traps prematurely. Therefore, think of Piercing Light as training wheels unless you are being W-keyed, in which case you might benefit more from the reduced trap cooldown. The rest of the trait choices just boil down to more damage, therefore I will not cover them. On Guild Wars 2 Miss and Meta Battle, the Virtues trait line is listed as the default. For that one stun break on your F3 every 51 seconds, you are trading a big hit to your damage output, and if you do use the F3 for a stun break, you can no longer use it offensively. You cannot even reach 100% crit cap with Virtues. Therefore, I strongly do not recommend Virtues. If you have stability issues, it is better to swap to Core Guardian, which has 2 stun breaks. Tip 1. Positioning. The first and most important tip is going to be about positioning. Your positioning is extremely important since you have no stun breaks. You want to position yourself 100 to 300 range behind your tag, and not stay directly on the tag, so that you can still receive boons while avoiding most of the damage and CC. The key thing is to not get left behind when trading places with the enemy group on pushes. If you find yourself caught behind, immediately use your renewed focus, even if all your virtues are not on cooldown. Or you could leap with F2 if the damage pressure is very low. In this clip, the damage is too heavy for a safe F2. The only times you might want to be in front of the tag is when you are dropping traps with F3 and F2, but more on that later. If you have only one dodge and have no defensive cooldowns left, use your dodges more conservatively and don't make big plays. Tip 2. The basic rotation. The second tip is the basic idealized all-in rotation. Start with Longbow 4, then Longbow 5, F3, leap in with F2, drop both traps, then cast Scepter 2, Sword of Justice, followed by Torch 5. Use Torch 4 for single targets. Before swapping, cast Scepter 2 again. This way we get 2 uses of Symbol of Punishment instead of just 1. Then weapon swap to Longbow for Longbow 4 and 2. Swap back to Scepter and repeat until your traps and cages come off cooldown. This rotation is going to work against smaller groups or inexperienced groups. Note that it is very easy to cancel Longbow 5. You cannot kill your next skill when casting Longbow 5 in the current version of the game. Against larger groups, when there is too much AoE, leaping in with F2 is not advisable. You instead want to skip F2 and the traps and jump straight to Sword of Justice and Scepter 2. Unlike PvE, rotations don't really exist in World vs. World because the enemy is going to react differently each time, and you can be interrupted with CC, Bone Strip or damage. Also, unlike PvE, your opponents are going to try to dodge out of your damage, get out of range of your abilities, heal your damage, cleanse your conditions, and have access to the same gear and builds that you do. Therefore, you must use your skills situationally and try to fit your scenario to the idealized rotations as closely as possible instead of blindly adhering to it. Do not use traps when the enemy group is too far away. Your traps form a big part of your damage, but you can only drop your traps at your feet, which limits what you can do with them. Randomly dropping traps means you get very random results because there are many things that can trigger your traps prematurely, like the Revenant's Face Smash, random spell breakers running ahead of the attack, pets, roamers, or even NPCs. Do not try to predict if they will walk over your traps when your group is greater than 1200 range, because while it might look nice on arcDPS, your traps will not kill anything on their own. Furthermore, it is more likely that your traps will get triggered randomly, and when you do need your traps, you will be on cooldown. In this clip, I drop one of my traps when the enemy is 1200 range away, and they never end up walking over it. Generally, the better commanders will not continuously push in a straight line. The test of faith here is also too shallow to matter. Moreover, the enemy group can fake a push and then go off to the sides, completely avoiding your traps, or they can avoid overlapping their group with yours, also completely avoiding the traps. More on how to deal with this later. When you are about to die, do not panic drop your traps, because you might never know if your friendly firebrand has a signal for you. Note that traps do not trigger on downed players. Tip 4. Concentrate your damage on one spot. Try to use your skills on the same spot, that is, to stack damage on the same spot instead of spreading all your AoEs. This is because when your AoEs stack, they are no longer soft pressure damage, but become burst damage, which increases the probability that you will down enemy players. In World vs. World, because players can heal, it is best to do most of the damage in a small window. Examples of such skills are Face Smash on Hammer Revenant, Arc Divider on Berserker, and Whirling Wrath on Guardian, etc. Then there are skills that do strike damage over time, like Lava Fawn, Wells, Scorched Earth, and Symbols. These are soft pressure damage skills, and even though they can accumulate big numbers over time, they are more likely to be partially healed, essentially negating the damage dealt. The worst offenders are Ranger Longbow Barrage and certain condition builds. That is not to say that pressure damage is completely useless. For one, it prevents enemies from free casting on you and also saturates the enemy heals, so that burst damage can more easily result in down players. Therefore, whenever possible, you should aim to use most of your skills in one spot. Tip 5. Be patient with your skills. Open field World vs. World is not the same as open field PvE, as some seem to think. In PvE, you follow a strict rotation where you try to place all your big DPS skills on cooldown before weapon swapping, or you try to reduce the downtime on DPS on a mostly stationary boss. In World vs. World, the better groups are going to be constantly moving and dodging out of your damage. Uptime on DPS is also not critical, especially if it is out of sync with your group's damage, unless you are finishing downed players. Therefore, do not use your skills just for the sake of putting it on cooldown. Observe that I only swapped Scepter when they enter 900 range. Swapping into Scepter would have locked me out of my 1200 range skills. It is also advisable to avoid using your AoE skills like Scepter 2 on a single moving target that is about to go out of the range threshold, unless the target is CC'd or down, but this isn't a rule that always applies for all situations. It is possible that your skills will come off cooldown when the enemy group comes back into range, or it could also be on cooldown when you most need it. You must make the decision yourself. Do not adhere to a strict rotation. The rotation is just a guideline in World vs. World. Tip 6. Your panic buttons are Shelter and Renewed Focus. Do not use F3 as a panic button. This is a really common mistake. F3 only blocks things in front of you, and unless you want to backpedal slowly, which I really do not recommend, the F3 is going to be wasted and you are going to be left behind to die. What do you do against pirate ships where both commanders never attempt to overlap both groups together, where both commanders never push? Do I just not get any usage out of my traps in that instance? In these scenarios, you will want to use F3 and F2 into the enemy group. F3 blocks most hits from the front, while F2 immobilizes for 3 seconds if you are traded with Soaring Devastation. This is an inherently risky maneuver because there are certain unblockable skills, most notably wells, but there is no reward without risk. It is heavily not recommended you try this if your stability source is inconsistent, because certain CC skills are unblockable. Do this when you are roughly within 1 dodge of your ally commander, or if you anticipate that your commander is going to push. In my experience, you have to predict that your commander is going to push before he or she even announces it. This is because the F2 leap takes a while to cast, and you are typically situated behind the tech. Since the better groups are going to react to your group's push, you might just jump on nothing and waste your cooldowns. If you see downed enemy players, it is also a good idea to jump in with F2 and F3, because you can typically expect your commander to push the downs. Do not do this if you are being double keyed, because your damage will be way off the tag, and you don't need to take this much risk since your opponents are eager to walk into your traps anyway. Tip 8. Punish the cloud. Use your single targets on isolated players that are freely attacking your group, especially those that get caught in your cages. It is a common rookie mistake to ignore free casters when the main enemy group is far away. Your main priority is the main enemy group. Your second priority is the enemy free casters that are clouding around you. Especially in objectives, do not just pump all your damage into the Lord when facing a cloud. The Lord is not the threat, the players around you are. This should not be confused with chasing the cloud to Narnia. You always want to be keeping an eye on your commander so that you do not get left behind. Your goal is to use your damage to deter them from casting freely. If you get the kill, that is a bonus. Similarly, if you see players that are caught in the back by gankers, you should peel for them without putting yourself in danger. Just a few auto attacks or true shots will suffice. You do not have to kill the gankers, just some damage to get them to back off. If they do continue, then they will die. Make your support's life easier. If you do decide to finish an enemy player, know your limits and do not get too far off the tag such that it will expose you to other gankers. In addition to looking out for your tag, you should also look around for the main enemy group such that they do not catch you by surprise. Tip 9. Use your projectiles on isolated targets or downed enemy players, not on the main group. A big problem when using the longbow is reflex, and reflex in the game are very poorly telegraphed. Firstly, it is difficult to tell that there is some form of projectile block. Even if you do see a wall of reflection or scrapper defense field, you do not know if it is allied or hostile. Secondly, all projectile blocks do not have a target cap, meaning a single wall of reflection can block an infinite number of projectiles. In particular, Wall of Refraction is your worst enemy, not only because it is so wide, but also because the one who places it down is likely a power core guardian, in which case you can kill yourself with Longbow 2. Longbow 4 is also a projectile. This means, unlike Scepter 2, it can be blocked by reflex and terrain, meaning you want to use it where the enemy group is headed to, not where they currently are. Therefore, you are best off using your projectiles on isolated targets that are off-tag or down players where there are no reflex. This is also the reason why you skip Longbow 2 and go straight into Scepter in the rotation, because it only takes a single projectile block to render your entire groups true shot useless. Tip 10. Pick up Fiery Greatsword left by Weavers. By now you should notice that I am a certified Fiery Greatsword enjoyer. Weavers are often stuck in Party 1 without stability, even though they actually provide insane utility to the group in the form of Fiery Greatsword. Fiery Greatsword replaces only your weapon skills with strong melee skills. You still have access to your traps and virtues. However, the auto attack is a projectile, which means it can be blocked. Fiery Greatsword synergizes well with weapon skills that have long cooldowns, like Longbow 5 or Meteor Shower. For instance, do not pick up Fiery Greatsword if you are a Scourge, because your role is to strip boons and you have very low cooldowns on your weapons. Needless to say, supports should not be picking Fiery Greatsword up. Take note that picking up weapons takes 0.5 seconds and there is a 0.5 second aftercast. During this 0.5 second aftercast, you cannot cast any other skills. Also take note that Fiery Greatsword 5 has a 1.1 second aftercast, but you cannot store the weapon to cancel this aftercast. This results in very clunky behavior, where you cannot, for instance, use Shelter or Renewed Focus right after casting Fiery Greatsword 5. There is an inherent risk in trying to pick up the Fiery Greatsword. In addition to the 0.5 second aftercast, the interact key to pick up bundles is also shared with reviving allies and finishing down players. But the game prioritizes the latter. You can be locked into a revive animation instead of picking up the weapon, especially if you play on 200 to 300 ping. Furthermore, there isn't a good way to distinguish allied from enemy Fiery Greatswords from afar, because they literally look the same. You also need to look out for the Fiery Greatsword on the ground, in addition to monitoring your cooldowns, movement of both allied and enemy commanders, etc., which stretches your attention. This section covers positioning against an organized group when you have no organized tag. This is known as clouding, which so happens to be the national sport of Maguma. I do not have stability, and the Scourge commander here is a Chatmander, so there is little reason to follow the tag too closely. You'll want to spread yourself evenly so your enemy has no easy targets for their AoE skills, and are forced to either resort to only single target skills or to waste their AoE skills on a single player. You will also want to avoid the enemy commander's attention and not get too close to the enemy group for a prolonged period of time. If you see the enemy group moving toward you, head in a different direction or risk getting focused. Punish any stragglers because these are the lowest risk and easiest kills. Every time you see a tail, it's an opportunity to leap in with F2, drop both traps, and then get out. Let me know what you want covered next in the comments, and I will try my best. Subscribe to see more exclusive, in-depth World vs. World content, and share it with any you think might benefit. Until next time.